In the autumn of 1918, the thunder of cannons finally faded. Germany's armies were retreating, exhausted after years of brutal trench warfare. What began as a proud march toward victory had turned into a desperate fight for survival. As the Allies advanced, Germany's leaders faced a grim truth: the war was lost. An armistice was signed, and the nation that once dreamed of conquest now tasted bitter defeat. For millions of Germans, it felt less like peace and more like surrender. On the streets, hunger gnawed at families. Blockades had starved the cities, and children went without food. The war was over, but the suffering was only beginning. In the factories, workers erupted in strikes, demanding change. Angry voices filled the air, shouting for bread, for wages, for a new future. Civil unrest spread like fire through the crumbling empire. At the same time, soldiers limped home from the front. They carried wounds, both visible and hidden, and found no honor waiting, only poverty and shame. Germany's proud veterans became symbols of a nation in despair. As chaos spread, whispers of communist revolution grew louder. The Russian Empire had already fallen to Bolsheviks, and many feared Germany would be next. The ruling parties acted quickly, determined to crush any uprising before it consumed them. Out of this turmoil, politicians gathered to form a new government. The old imperial system was gone. In its place, they announced a bold experiment. A parliamentary democracy, the Weimar Republic, was born from desperation. But its birth was far from celebrated. To some, it felt like betrayal, a surrender to foreign powers and radical ideas. From the start, the Republic carried the weight of suspicion and distrust. Germany's future was now tied to fragile democratic institutions. But these leaders inherited a nation broken by war, hunger, and rage. Their first test would come almost immediately, with the signing of a treaty that would scar Germany's pride. Thus ended the German Empire, and thus began the fragile Weimar Republic. It was a nation wounded and humiliated, unsure whether it would survive the storms ahead. And in the shadows of this chaos, a restless veteran named Adolf Hitler was waiting. In 1919, German delegates were summoned to Versailles. They arrived not as equals, but as the accused, forced to face judgment for a war they had already lost. The treaty was not a negotiation, it was a punishment. The terms were brutal. Germany was stripped of land, colonies, and pride. Its army was dismantled, its navy reduced to almost nothing, and its skies forbidden to host an air force. Worst of all, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It declared Germany solely responsible for the Great War. The nation had to pay crushing reparations that would bleed its economy dry for decades. When news of the treaty spread, anger erupted in the streets. Nationalists called it a betrayal. The stab-in-the-back myth took root, and many swore revenge. The Republic's leaders were branded traitors for accepting the shame. Ordinary Germans felt the humiliation deeply. Families watched their savings evaporate, while veterans felt their sacrifices had been spat upon. The Versailles Treaty was more than politics. It was a wound to the German soul. Among the people, resentment grew like a poison. Every lost job, every hungry child, every broken family seemed to trace back to Versailles. The Republic's foundation trembled under this bitterness. In beer halls and meeting places, fiery speeches echoed. Orators shouted of betrayal, conspiracies, and enemies within. The anger that Versailles ignited was becoming fuel for dangerous ideas. Across the nation, anti-Semitic whispers grew louder. Jews, despite being loyal citizens, were accused of profiteering and betrayal. Bigotry found new life in the soil of fear and defeat. Germany was a nation adrift, humiliated abroad, divided at home. The people longed for someone, anyone, who could restore their pride. This longing would make them vulnerable to voices promising greatness. And in the midst of this anger and despair, an unknown veteran was listening. His name was Adolf Hitler, and soon he would transform his fury into a movement that would shake the world. After the war, Adolf Hitler was just another defeated soldier. He wandered through the streets of Munich, aimless, jobless, and burning with resentment. He found refuge in angry gatherings where veterans and nationalists cursed the Republic, the Allies, and the so-called traitors. It was here that his hatred began to take shape. In 1919, Hitler attended a meeting of a small nationalist group, the German Workers' Party. Their ideas mirrored his own: anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and dreams of restored glory. At first, he was a listener, but when he spoke, his fiery words stunned the room. His voice carried not just anger, but conviction. The party quickly realized his talent. They gave him a platform, and he gave them a vision. Soon, the German Workers' Party evolved into something new: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis. Hitler's speeches became the party's heartbeat. He spoke in crowded beer halls where smoke filled the air and anger filled the hearts of his audience. He promised revenge, pride, and unity. To his followers, Hitler was not just a politician. He was a prophet. Every word painted Jews, communists, and foreign powers as enemies of the people. The Nazi movement grew slowly but steadily. They waved flags, wore uniforms, and marched with precision, giving a broken people a sense of belonging. But Hitler wanted more. He saw the weakness of the Republic and believed he could seize power through force. In 1923, he and his followers stormed the streets of Munich in a failed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The rebellion collapsed, and Hitler was arrested for treason. Yet, behind prison bars, he was not silenced. Instead, he began to write the book that would spread his poisonous vision. In prison, Hitler had time to reflect, to plan, and to write. His book, Mein Kampf, outlined his hateful ideology and his vision for Germany's future. Though his words were filled with venom, they struck a chord with those who felt lost and betrayed after the war. The book became the foundation of Nazi propaganda. Released after less than a year, Hitler stepped out of prison not defeated, but determined. He knew that violence alone would not bring him power. He began to reshape the Nazi Party, turning it into a political machine. Newspapers, posters, and symbols carried his message across Germany. The swastika, once an ancient sign, was reborn as a bold emblem of Nazi identity. It flew on banners, armbands, and walls, demanding attention. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master of propaganda, crafted speeches, films, and rallies that glorified the Nazi cause. They understood that emotion, not reason, would win the masses. Mass rallies became theaters of power. Tens of thousands gathered under torchlight, their voices joining in chants of loyalty. It was politics turned into spectacle. Hitler's words promised strength, pride, and national rebirth. He offered simple enemies for complex problems: Jews, communists, and foreign powers. The Nazis also built paramilitary groups, the brown-shirted stormtroopers. They patrolled the streets, intimidated opponents, and made Nazi presence impossible to ignore. Germany was changing. And though the Nazis were not yet the dominant power, they were no longer just a fringe group. They were a rising force, waiting for the right crisis to open the door to power. In 1929, disaster struck. The American stock market crashed, and the Great Depression swept across the world. In Germany, the economy collapsed overnight. Banks closed, businesses failed, and millions lost their jobs. Long lines formed outside soup kitchens. Families stood in the cold, waiting for a piece of bread to survive another day. Desperation spread like wildfire. Ordinary people who had once lived in comfort were now drowning in poverty. The Weimar government seemed powerless. Politicians argued endlessly while offering no real solutions. In this chaos, Hitler's voice grew louder. He promised jobs, stability, and a return to Germany's former greatness. He gave the people someone to blame: Jews, communists, and traitors within the government, scapegoats for a suffering nation. While mainstream parties fought each other, the Nazi Party gained strength. In just 2 years, their share of votes leapt from under 3% to over 18%. Ordinary Germans, tired of hunger and humiliation, began to see Hitler not as a radical, but as a savior. By the early 1930s, the Nazi movement had grown into a political storm, and the man at its center was closer than ever to power. In 1932, Adolf Hitler made his boldest move yet. He ran for president of Germany. His opponent was Paul von Hindenburg, a decorated war hero and a symbol of old Germany. He drew massive crowds. He flew across the country, delivering fiery speeches that promised hope and strength. Though he lost the election, gaining 36% of the vote proved something crucial. Millions now stood behind him. The result shocked the political establishment. Hitler had transformed from an outsider into a national figure. Yet Germany was still unstable. The Depression raged on, unemployment soared, and riots filled the streets. Behind closed doors, conservative advisors and wealthy businessmen saw Hitler as a tool. They believed they could use his popularity for their own gain. Hindenburg, pressured by these elites, reluctantly appointed Hitler as chancellor in January. In 1933, to many, it seemed like a compromise. They thought Hitler could be controlled, his power contained. But they were wrong. Hitler was not content with being chancellor. He was already preparing his next move to seize total control. Just weeks after Hitler became chancellor, disaster struck. The Reichstag, Germany's parliament building, was set on fire. A young worker was arrested for the blaze, but Hitler wasted no time in twisting the event to his advantage. He declared that Germany was under threat from a communist uprising. Fear swept the nation. Ordinary citizens believed chaos was just around the corner. Hitler played the role of protector, insisting that only he could restore safety and order. Using the fire as justification, he persuaded President Hindenburg to grant him emergency powers. Those powers stripped away essential freedoms: free speech, free press, and the right to protest. Opposition parties were banned, political enemies were jailed, and Nazi paramilitary groups filled the streets with intimidation. For many Germans, daily life changed overnight. The republic they once knew was dissolving before their eyes. And for Hitler, this was just the beginning. With emergency powers in his hands, the path to dictatorship lay wide open. With emergency powers secured, Hitler turned his focus to silencing anyone who could challenge him. New anti-Jewish laws were passed, stripping Jewish citizens of rights and marking them as outsiders. Opposition leaders, journalists, and outspoken. Critics were arrested. Many vanished without a trace. Hitler's paramilitary forces, the SA and SS, roamed the streets, spreading terror and crushing protests. Inside the Nazi Party, some early supporters had grown too powerful. Hitler saw them as rivals to his authority. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, many of these men were executed in secret purges. Businessmen and intellectuals, once skeptical, now lined up to support Hitler, eager to protect their interests. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda spread through schools, newspapers, and radios, shaping how millions thought and spoke. Then, in August 1934, President Hindenburg died. There would be no new election. Hitler merged the office of president with chancellor, declaring himself Führer. Democracy in Germany was officially dead. By 1934, Adolf Hitler stood unchallenged at the head of Germany. The Nazi salute replaced democratic debate, and loyalty to the Führer became law. Posters, parades, and speeches glorified him as Germany's savior. Many Germans embraced this new order, believing Hitler would restore their nation's lost greatness. Others lived in fear, silenced by prisons, censorship, or the threat of violence. Step by step, democratic institutions had been dismantled, not with one sudden blow, but through a series of calculated moves. The world watched, some with concern, but many underestimated how far Hitler's ambitions would go. Within just a few years, his dictatorship would lead to war, destruction, and genocide on a scale the world had never seen. His rise is a chilling reminder of how fragile freedom can be when anger, fear, and hatred are allowed to guide politics. The story of Hitler's rise remains a warning. Democracy survives only if people defend it, together and without hesitation.